Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely.
All right. So today we're heading to early 20th century Chicago.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah. A city full of, immigrants chasing the American dream.
Yeah.
And we're going to uncover the life of Frank, the young man who died in the Eastland disaster in 1915.
Right.
And you guys remember that the Eastland was that passenger ship that capsized while it was still docked,
Yeah.
leading to the deaths of over 800 people.
So it's a horrific tragedy.
Awful. Absolutely awful.
Mm-hmm.
So our main source for this is the Flower in the River podcast.
Oh, great podcast.
Yeah, it's really good. And let me tell you, Frank's story has some really interesting twists.
Oh, I love a good twist.
So we start with Frank's obituary.
Okay.
It tells us he was 19 years old working at Western Electric and was a boxer.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah, known as Young Hanlon.
Young Handlin.
You already start to get the feeling that there's more to this guy than meets the eye.
Right.
But then we hit a snag with the Cook County coroner's reports. One lists him as Stanley Fuca, age 21,
Oh.
while the other correctly has him as Frank.
So what's interesting about this is it really shows you the limits of historical records.
Oh.
How do we as researchers reconcile these conflicting pieces of information?
Right.
It's a good reminder to always be kind of critical of historical sources, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And in Frank's case, it makes the story even more tragic because Frank did have an older brother named Stanley, who also died in 1915.
Oh, wow. What happened to Stanley?
He died from rabies after being bitten by a dog.
Oh, no.
So just imagine how devastating that must have been for that family.
To lose two sons so close together?
Yeah, within months of each other, it's just heartbreaking.
Absolutely heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
Well, luckily, the 1910 census kind of fills in some gaps.
Okay.
So it says Frank was working as a clerk in an artist's shop at only 14.
14.
Yeah, and he never went to school but could still read and write.
Wow.
And get this, there's even a chance he applied for a marriage license at 17 in 1912.
Wow, so different from how kids grow up today.
Yeah. I mean, 14, working, maybe married at 17, it's a different world.
Total different world, right?
Yeah, and speaking of different worlds, Frank's obituary lists an address
Okay.
that if it's still standing today would be a classic Chicago 3-flat.
Oh, yeah.
You know those brick buildings that house so many working and middle-class families?
Yeah, you can totally picture it.
Can you picture him, heading out each day from one of those apartments?
It's like those buildings are little time capsules,
Right.
They help us visualize the city how Frank would have seen it.
Exactly. And we even have a location for one of his boxing matches.
Oh, really?
The Irwin Opera House.
Okay.
In St. Charles, which is about 35 miles outside of Chicago.
Oh, cool. So those opera houses were like the entertainment center, right, in those smaller towns.
Yeah.
Hosting everything from, theater troupes to these local boxing matches.
Wow.
It makes you wonder what the atmosphere was like, the night Frank fought there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, okay, we can't talk about Frank's boxing without talking about the wider boxing scene.
Right.
In early 20th century Chicago, why do you think this sport was so popular?
Oh, well, it was huge, especially in immigrant communities like the one Frank belonged to.
Yeah. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think it wasn't just about the sport itself,
Mm-hmm.
Boxing gyms were like social hubs.
Okay.
Places where young men could find camaraderie,
Right.
build strength,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even see a path to a better life.
Yeah.
For immigrants especially, it was a way to prove themselves in America,
Yeah.
to gain recognition and respect.
That makes sense. And it seems like the lines between amateur and professional boxing were pretty blurred back then.
Oh, yeah, totally. Officially, amateurs weren't supposed to get paid, but there were ways around it.
Okay.
Prize money could be disguised, and side betting was everywhere, even at the so-called amateur events.
Interesting.
Some boxers even fought under different names.
Really?
Yeah, to keep their amateur status while still earning money.
Oh, wow.
So maybe that's what Frank was doing as young Hanlon.
Huh. So he could have been even more involved in the boxing world than we thought.
Yeah, definitely. It just adds another layer to his story.
Yeah, for sure.
And it just shows how resourceful and ambitious those immigrants were when they came to Chicago.
Okay, and here's a twist that really surprised me.
Okay, I love twists.
Women were taking up boxing in 1915.
Oh, way!
Yeah, we found an article in the Day Book, which was a Chicago newspaper,
Okay.
talking about society women paying tons of money for boxing lessons.
Wow, that's amazing.
They even mentioned a professional female boxer, Carolyn Bowman, who just a few years earlier was a debutante in Washington, D.C.
Wow, talk about breaking boundaries.
Right.
It really challenges how we think about gender roles back then.
Yeah, totally.
Makes you wonder if Frank ever ran into any of these women training in the boxing gyms.
Oh, that would have been so interesting.
Right, what a scene.
All right, but for now, let's shift gears a bit
Okay.
and talk about Frank's family, specifically his niece and nephew. They both achieved some amazing things later in life.
Oh, wow. Like what?
So his niece, Patricia A. Blazer Holliday, became a powerful voice for women's equality.
Wow.
She helped found the Sacramento chapter of NOW and was key in getting the Equal Rights Amendment passed in California.
That's incredible.
And his nephew, William L. Blazer, was a World War II veteran who received the Bronze Star.
Wow.
Yeah, he became a successful businessman and the Illinois state legislator and even the director of the Illinois EPA.
Wow. What a legacy.
Right. It really makes you think, what might Frank have accomplished had his life not been cut short?
That's a good question.
It's really sad to think about, but, maybe these achievements in his family reflect that potential that was lost that day in 1915.
It's a nice way to look at it.
Yeah, so before we get too lost in thought, let's do a quick recap.
Okay, good idea.
Okay, we've got Frank Fuqua, a young factory worker and boxer living in this rapidly changing Chicago.
Right.
We've uncovered these discrepancies in official records, hints of a maybe double life in the boxing ring, and a family that experienced both tragedy and remarkable achievement.
It's quite a story.
What stands out to you so far?
I think what's most intriguing is how Frank's story intersects with all these big trends of the time.
Yeah.
Immigration, the rise of boxing women's changing roles.
Mm.
He's like a lens for us to view all these bigger forces shaping American society.
That's such a good point. It's like by piecing together his life, we're getting a glimpse into a whole era.
Exactly. And there's still so much more to uncover.
I know, right? So stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into the life and legacy of Frank Fuqua.
It's easy to get caught up in the details of Frank's life.
Yeah.
But, we can't forget about the bigger picture.
The Eastland disaster.
Yeah, this wasn't just a statistic.
Right.
Over 800 people died that day.
It's hard to even fathom.
Each with their own stories and families and loved ones left behind.
Yeah, it's a really sobering reminder that history is made up of individual lives.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we get so focused on the big events that we forget about the personal stories that make history come alive.
Exactly. And when you think about how huge the Eastland disaster was,
Yeah.
it's almost impossible to imagine the grief that just swept through Chicago.
It must have been overwhelming.
Yeah. And Frank's story is just one tiny part of this much bigger story of loss.
It makes you wonder how a city recovers from something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, they were dealing with this unimaginable tragedy.
Right.
But at the same time, all these societal changes were happening.
It's true. History's never neat and tidy.
Right.
While the city was mourning the Eastland victims,
Yeah.
you also had women pushing boundaries,
Uh-huh.
new forms of entertainment popping up,
Mm-hmm.
a world war on the horizon.
And speaking of those women taking up boxing,
Oh, yeah.
there's this detail in the Daybook article that I found really interesting.
Okay, what is it?
Some of those society women were paying professional boxers $25 an hour for lessons.
Whoa.
That's a ton of money for back then.
That shows how serious they were.
Yeah, they were clearly determined to learn.
Even if it meant going against the norm
Yeah.
and maybe causing a little scandal.
Can you imagine what people must have been saying?
Oh, I bet there was a lot of gossip.
And it wasn't just about fitness.
No.
The article mentions 2 amateur female boxers
Okay.
who were going to fight at a charity event.
Whoa, really?
But they were planning to wear masks to hide their identities.
That's fascinating.
I know, right?
It really shows how much pressure they must have felt.
Yeah, like they could face backlash.
Right, for stepping outside those traditional gender roles.
You have to admire their courage.
Absolutely, they were pioneers.
It just shows that even though the world was changing so rapidly,
Yeah.
there was still this tension between tradition and progress.
It was a time of both excitement and uncertainty.
Yeah.
People were trying to figure out these new ideas and possibilities,
It must have been an amazing time to be alive.
especially for young people like Frank.
Can you imagine the energy in Chicago? This was a city on the rise.
Mm-hmm. A hub of industry and innovation.
Exactly. But, it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Right, there was poverty,
Yeah.
crime,
Mm-hmm.
social inequalities.
Yeah, it's easy to romanticize the past,
It's true.
but we can't forget about the complexities.
And the struggles that people face.
Yeah, those were real people with real problems just like us today.
Absolutely, and that's what makes these deep dives so valuable.
Yeah.
They help us see the past in all its messiness.
Not just the good parts.
Yeah, the good and the bad.
And through all that messiness, we can find connections to our own lives.
Right.
Our own struggle.
Our own hopes for the future.
Okay, so speaking of connections,
Yeah.
let's go back to Frank's niece and nephew for a minute.
Okay.
Their achievements were just incredible.
They really were.
Especially considering their family history.
Yeah, they lost their uncle in the Eastland disaster,
Right, and then their dad died when Patricia was only 13.
leaving Antoinette to raise them on her own.
Yeah, during some pretty tough times.
It's hard to imagine what impact those losses must have had on them.
But they didn't let tragedy define them.
No, they both went on to live such accomplished lives.
It really speaks to their resilience and determination.
Absolutely.
Do you think their family history, especially the Eastland disaster,
Mm-hmm.
might have influenced their desire to make a positive impact on the world?
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
Maybe those experiences gave them a sense of how fragile life is
Okay,
and a need to make their time count.
that makes sense.
Or maybe it made them more empathetic.
To others who are struggling.
Right, and led them to dedicate their lives to things like social justice and public service.
It's fascinating to think about those connections,
Yeah.
how the past can echo through generations.
Absolutely.
So what stands out to you about Patricia and William's stories?
What resonates most?
Yeah.
I think it's the contrast between their personal tragedies
Mm-hmm.
and their incredible achievements.
Yeah.
It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to overcome adversity
Mm-hmm.
and find meaning even when things are really tough.
It reminds us that we all have the potential to make a difference.
Yeah, no matter what we've been through.
That's a powerful message.
It really is.
It's like their stories are saying life can be incredibly hard,
Yeah.
but even when things are painful and heartbreaking,
Mm-hmm.
there's still hope.
There's still possibility for good
Yeah, for growth.
and for making a positive contribution to the world.
And those contributions can take so many different forms.
Exactly.
For Patricia, it was advocating for women's rights and equality.
Mm-hmm.
And for William, it was serving in the war,
Yeah.
building a successful career,
Mm-hmm.
and devoting himself to public service.
It's like they took the pain of their family's past
Yeah.
and turned it into a force for good.
It's really inspiring.
And it just shows how interconnected our lives are,
Yeah.
how the actions of one generation
Mm-hmm.
can have a ripple effect.
Those who come after.
We're all part of a larger human story,
Yeah.
a continuum of experiences,
That shapes who we are.
and what we do with our lives.
And in Frank's case, even though he died so young,
Right.
his story still lives on,
Through his family.
not just through their achievements, but also through the ripple effects of their actions.
Exactly. It reminds us that history isn't just about remembering what happened in the past.
Yeah.
It's also about understanding how the past shapes the present and the future.
That's a really good point. So as we head into the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we'll explore that impact even more.
That's good.
We'll delve deeper into Patricia and William's legacies and see how their lives reflect the bigger themes we've been talking about.
Okay, like what?
Resilience,
Right.
determination,
Uh-huh.
and the enduring power of the human spirit. We've been talking about Frank Fuca's life and how it was cut short by the Eastland disaster.
Right. A real tragedy.
But then his niece and nephew went on to lead these remarkable lives.
They really did.
It's almost like their achievements are a continuation of his story in a way.
It's an interesting thought. We know their father died when Patricia was only 13.
Yeah, leaving their mom Antoinette to raise them during some pretty tough times.
Imagine the strength and resilience they must have learned from her.
And growing up in the shadow of the Eastland disaster with the loss of their uncle so fresh,
Right.
it's hard to imagine that not shaping how they saw the world.
It makes you wonder if that shared family experience kind of fueled their drive.
To make a positive impact.
Exactly.
Patricia's work for women's equality is really striking.
It is. She was a founding member of the Sacramento and now W chapter.
Yeah,
And instrumental in getting the Equal Rights Amendment passed in California.
that's a powerful legacy.
It is, and it connects back to those women in 1915.
The ones taking up boxing.
Yeah, bravely defying those social expectations.
Right. Patricia fighting for a more just and equal society was kind of carrying that torch forward.
In her own way.
Absolutely. And then you have William serving in World War II, earning a Bronze Star.
Right, and achieving success in business law and government.
A life dedicated to service in so many different ways.
It's incredible, and it brings us back to Frank.
Working at Western Electric.
Yeah, with his passion for boxing.
We can only speculate, but maybe William's accomplishments, in a way, reflect the potential that Frank never got to fulfill.
Like, that potential found a new way to come out.
Yeah, through the lives of his niece and nephew.
It's fascinating because even though we're focused on Patricia and William's achievements,
Yeah,
their stories aren't really about individual glory.
right.
It's about making a difference for others, for their community,
Right.
for something bigger than themselves.
And that brings us back to the heart of Frank's story.
Yeah.
Even though his life was tragically cut short,
Right.
his legacy lives on.
Through his family.
Not just through their achievements,
Right.
but also through the ripple effects of their actions.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history isn't just about remembering the past.
Yeah.
It's also about understanding how that past shapes the present and the future.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the life of Frank Fuqua,
What are the big takeaways for you?
what's the so what of all this?
Yeah.
For me, it's the power of these individual stories to really highlight those bigger historical trends.
Okay.
Frank's life becomes a window into early 20th century Chicago,
Right.
immigration, the rise of boxing women's changing roles.
Yeah. And then through his family, we see the lasting impact of the Eastland disaster.
Not just as a tragedy.
Right, but as something that shaped the lives and choices of the generations that followed.
Absolutely.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about dates and facts.
Right.
It's about people's lived experiences.
Their struggles, their triumphs, their connections with each other.
And by digging into these personal stories, we get a deeper understanding of what it means to be human.
We see the challenges people faced back then.
Their resilience, their hopes, and their dreams.
And in recognizing that we find connections to our own lives.
Our own experiences.
Yeah, our own place in this grand tapestry of human history.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Thank you. And I think that's the real magic of these deep dives.
Yeah.
They make us rethink things. They broaden our understanding of the past.
And ultimately, they connect us to something larger than ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, we hope this exploration of Frank Fuqua's life has piqued your curiosity.
Yeah.
And inspired you to keep uncovering these hidden stories.
The ones that shape our world.
So until our next deep dive,
Keep exploring
keep questioning,
and keep learning.